Voltia released in the Battle Pass of Season 2, right at the time where damage shields got introduced to the game. Thanks for that, Freyna. Now, while the gun was respectable for mobbing, it really shone as a gun that you could tap and make shields a thing of the past, boasting insane amounts of damage to pop them and chains that reach across rooms of enemies. With the introduction of weapon cores though, we now have the ability to turn it from just a utility tool into a deadly mobbing weapon. In today's video, we'll be looking at my current build for the Voltia, looking at what we've changed since my last build, how to maximise its DPS, and if it's worthy of your weapon cores. So strap yourself in, and let's get to it. So as we always do, let's start off with what makes the weapon so unique, and then we can shift our way over to the module side of things. Now, looking at the base stats when it comes to the Voltia, one of the main things that did get changed with the recent update is the fact that it now has a separate thing including the amount of electric attack. Now, it does have a base of 2,635, along with the base firearm attack of 8,499. It's quite surprising as to how much of a difference this really does make, because we are going to be leaning a lot into electric attack, and this is essentially going to be even more than doubling its DPS, because as to how we can actually go into it with the extra kind of benefits from its modules. Now, when it comes to rounds per magazine, it's already at a base of 42, which is kind of on the low side just due to the fact of how the stage mechanic kind of works when it comes to beam rifles. So increasing this will allow us to be able to increase the amount of DPS we have by staying at that stage 3 for much longer. On the plus side though, the firearm critical hit rate is okay, it's passable at 15%. This is definitely something that we can work with, especially with firearm based descendants like Haley, or going in for Enzo or even Blair, and being able to massively increase the amount of chance that we do have. So as you can also see, we don't have a decent multiplier for weak point, so we will be highly leaning into critical hit damage rather than going into weak point to be able to get the most out of this gun. When it comes to the unique ability though, essentially this allows us to be able to chain electricity across to multiple enemies. This at max rank will allow us to be able to do it for every 2 shots. This will then chain up to 6 extra enemies, so this is quite nice, but essentially this damage will only be 25% of our firearm damage. Now, this can be scaled through things like firearm attack, it can also be scaled by things like electric attack, and then also on top of that it will instantly pop shields because of how this extra mechanic of 4,000 times our firearm damage works when it comes to any of the shields that it will be going up against. So the main things that we will be building into to be able to get the most out of the Voltia is going to be things like firearm attack, electric attack, being able to go for magazine increases so that we have the most amount of DPS, being able to go for things like crit, and then being able to reduce our fire rate. Now, we'll cover this a little bit later when we get to those specific modules, but I will explain this to exactly the maths behind that. So let's start with things like firearm attack. Obviously, because we are going to be primarily using this to be able to deal damage, we will be wanting the main kind of things, which is the combo of rifling reinforcement as well as action and reaction. That's going to be giving us 93% increase to our firearm attack right off the bat. And as you can see, it's already feeling a bit more respectful when it comes to the amount of damage that we will be doing per shot in this gun. Now, we did also mention being able to go for crit, so of course we will be chucking in a couple of crit modifiers here. The main ones to be able to go for are going to be our tried and tested blue mods. That is going to be better insight and better concentration. Being able to do that is going to give us a nice respectful critical hit rate as well as our nice respectful critical hit damage multiplier, being able to get up to 2.232 before we start looking at extra rolls. Now, we did also mention things like magazine size, and magazine size is, like I said, pretty important due to the fact as to how we have that charge mechanic, because once you manage to get 2 charged at stage level 3, it seemed to be around about a 50% damage increase based on stage 1 compared to stage 3, so it is worth being able to stay at stage 3 for as long as possible to be able to increase the amount of DPS you will be doing. In this case, we will be using 2 of our modules right here, and that's going to be Expand Weapon Charge and Compulsive Magazine. While this will reduce our weak point damage multiplier, unfortunately, because we're not really going to be aiming for weak points with this gun, because we already mentioned about like its ridiculously low multiplier, we might as well increase our rounds per magazine even further, and that allows us to be able to go for something like this. So we get 88% increase to our rounds per magazine. That takes us up to 78 at base, so we're already off to a great start being able to increase the amount of damage with this gun, and that means that we won't be reloading as often when it comes to it. So now we're down to 4 modules, and we've already mentioned one of the attributes that we're going to be leaning into, and that's going to be electric. The reason why is because we already have electric built into the gun, so it makes the most sense for us to be able to compound that even further, and we can get even more benefits from being able to go into that. So the best way for us to be able to go is go into electric enhancements. This is going to be a great way of being able to increase the base amount of electric attack that we do have, and then we will go for electric gun barrel. Now, this is probably the time I'm going to mention why we're talking about fire rate reductions being fantastic for beam weapons, and the reason why is because when you start firing beam weapons, they don't necessarily really kind of like suffer from reduced fire rate. It does affect it originally, but essentially how it works is that we don't want to focus on the amount of damage when it comes to the first 2 stages of the gun, because that is technically lost DPS for us. Essentially, the best way to be able to get the most out of beam rifles is by reducing their fire rate, so that when it gets to the stage 3, you're then able to get the most DPS from all those shots going forwards. Now, when it comes to charging, this isn't based on the amount of shots that are fired, this is actually based on a certain amount of time, so essentially it makes more sense to actually reduce the amount of shots that we're going to be firing within that space of time, so that the rest of the magazine gets even more DPS. It means more shots are going to be benefiting from that increase, so it makes the most sense. So we are going to be reducing our fire rate by 25%. This also gives us one of the biggest increases to electric attack at 80%, which is fantastic, and obviously this is going to be compounded by going into electric enhancement, because it's going to take 30% of our firearm attack, and it's going to get chucked back into this extra 80% as well. So we're off to a great start, and these are fantastic mods to be able to actually go into and be able to include in this build. So that leaves us with 2 mods that we can actually start having a look at, and one of the best ones to be able to go in here, for the exact same reason as to why electric gun barrel was fantastic for its fire rate reduction, it's going to be sharp precision shots. Now the reason why we're going to slot this one in is because at base this will be reducing it by a further 20%, so we're already massively cutting our attack speed in half, or almost in half, when it comes to using these 2 mods. But essentially when you hold the trigger with this one, which we will be doing when it comes to beam rifles, we are going to be increasing our fire rate, we're going to be reducing our recoil, and we're increasing our firearm attack. Now why would we want that? Well, the increase to firearm attack is obviously fantastic, it means more DPS. On top of that, that's then going to get, because it's fed into base firearm attack, it's going to get fed into electric enhancements, which then gets even more from electric attack with the electric gun barrel. So we've already got a really nice synergy building up there. But on top of that, because we're reducing our fire rate for our first couple of stages by so much, essentially it means that most of our magazine is going to be spent towards the back end. Now by increasing our fire rate by the time we get to that back end, we're then essentially kind of like ramping ourselves up, so we are a massive DPS machine once we hit stage 3. By being able to get our essentially almost all of our fire rate back, all the way back up to base, by holding this down, by getting this all the way up to 10 stacks, essentially allows us to be able to stack up debuffs, allows us to be able to shoot out chains even faster, allows us to be able to get our firearm attack increased all the way up to 60%. It is fantastic. I do think this is probably the best mod to be able to go in this slot because of all the benefits that it kind of gives you. It's not the most amount of firearm attack that you can actually get. The best that one would actually be going to mental focus, because that allows you to be able to get up to 90% increase to your firearm attack, and it still does reduce your fire rate. That is still something that you can go for, but I found that being able to increase our fire rate once we get to that end side of things is going to help us out, especially with the next mod that we're going to be slotting in, and that is actually going to be high voltage plasma. So by increasing our electric attack by every single time we hit the same target over and over, and reducing that same target's defense, by being able to increase our fire rate, we're going to be increasing the amount of stacks and how fast these get generated onto that enemy. It is a fantastic combination, and I do think this is going to be the best in slot for being able to use those 2. So the best way to be able to get the most out of this gun is by finding a yellow bar elite, especially in Purge run 20s, being able to hold down the trigger so you start stacking up your sharp precision shot, as well as being able to get yourself up to stage 3, and then just hold this down. This will then reduce their amount of defense, it will increase your electric attack, and by increasing your electric attack, you're also increasing the amount of damage that is going to be coming off from the extra beams, so all the splits, and that is going to help get rid of all the trash mobs that are going to be found nearby to you. This is a fantastic weapon to be able to take in there, and it is definitely a deadly combination for being able to use with Crit Descendant, like Haley, or being able to use with Enzo. So now we can swap it over to our cores and we can finalize the rest of this build. Now I don't have the best rolls when it comes to this, I've just kind of essentially put this all together because the amount of weapons that I've kind of been messing about with, I've kind of ran out of like resources and everything like that, but essentially I've tried to put something in from that category so you can see what you should be building into. When it comes to the Voltia, in this case we do have 1 free augmentation, 1 firepower, 1 attribute, 1 tactical, and 1 special. Obviously special is pretty much kind of trash tier when it comes to most of the weapons. It will be slightly different with the Voltia depending on the attribute rolls that you do manage to get in here. It's not the worst thing in the world to be able to get a Legion of Darkness in here, because I believe they are weak to electric side of things, so you could actually increase the amount of damage. It's not a terrible shout, it would help you in like things like Purge run to level 20s, but most of the time you will be largely ignoring this. So things like tactical augmentation, best kind of in slot here is going to be rounds per magazine. Now the reason why is because obviously we've already covered it a little bit earlier, being able to have more shots towards the back end of your magazine for at that stage 3 means more DPS. Reload wasn't terrible with this one, obviously you could go for that, it's not the worst thing in the world. build. Fire rate I would avoid because as to all the kind of things that we've already talked about, but being rifle charge gain speed isn't terrible either. I do think that rounds per magazine is best in slot, so that will be the one that you should be aiming for. When it comes to attribute though, you should be going for electric attack. That is everything that we've pretty much built into. Firepower augmentation, obviously there's only going to be one in slot for this one because we're not going to be using this against Colossus, so therefore in this case firearm attack is going to be fantastic. And then when it comes to your free, you do technically have a choice. Obviously things like crit is going to be a decent one to be able to go into. Being able to increase your firearm attack is also pretty decent, but for me personally I think it makes the most sense to go and increase your electric attack even further. Your electric attack is going to be doing everything your firearm is already doing, but obviously much better. It's going to be spreading out to all the extra enemies. It's going to be dealing extra damage to enemies inside of Purge Run 20. Electric attack is pretty much king. It is so much better than firearm attack in my personal opinion, and because of as to how much you can kind of like stack up with this, and because it gets an extra roll of electric attack built into the gun for free, it just starts eclipsing firearm attack. It is just pretty much the best in slot for this, so therefore electric attack pretty much takes the cake for me. So if we have a look into we round up the rest of the build, you can see at base, just as standard, this is essentially what we're rocking with. We have 20.2k when it comes to electric firearm attack, 34.3k when it comes to electric. Our fire rate is cut massively all the way down to 459, but that will be increasing even further as you start holding down that trigger and obviously getting your SPS going. Rounds per magazine is sitting at 102. This could be increased even further with the right rolls, but 102 is still fantastic. Critical hit rate is 22.53, and obviously that does increase depending on the type of Descendant that you use, and then critical hit damage is 2.752, allowing us to be able to hit some really juicy shots. And with all out of the way, that wraps it up on the video for my updated Voltia build. When used right, this thing absolutely melts through crowds of enemies, and it's probably in the top 3 most satisfying weapons to shoot in the game, in my opinion. While it does chew its way through magazines fairly quickly, a few magazine upgrades should see you right, and you'll wish that you had this for all types of content. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you finding Season 2 so far? Will we ever see another Battle Pass weapon quite as strong as this one? And lastly, which weapon would you like to see next with some core unlocks? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video. As I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well. I'll see you all on the next video.